Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Thursday seminar, part of our Thursday evening seminar series. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the Wolfson Professor of Criminology and the Director of the Institute. The speaker this evening is Dr. Jake Phillips. Jake came to the Institute of Criminology in 2008 to complete his PhD here. That's where we got to know each other, exploring practice and culture in the probation service. Prior to starting his PhD, Jake had worked in various community roles with offenders and completed a Master of Science in Criminology and Criminal Justice at Edinburgh University. After graduating from the Institute in 2013, Jake spent 12 years at Sheffield Hallam University. His research focused on the intersection between policy and practice in criminal justice, and he has a particular expertise in emotional labor, staff well-being, probation policy, privatization, and technology. We're really pleased to welcome Jake back to the Institute earlier this year in his role as Associate Professor and Director of the MSD in Applied Criminology, Penology, and Management. Jake is the editor of the Probation's Journal and associate editor for the Journal of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and a member of the British Journal of Criminology's editorial board. He's also the co-chair of the European Society of Criminology's Working Group on Community Sanctions and Measures, and a member of the steering committee for the British Society of Criminology's Network on Probation and Community Justice. I'm delighted to invite Jake to come and speak to us as a new member of the Institute.
New and old.
New and old member, one of the people who is contributing to running one of our most important core programs, and I'm really delighted to learn more about his research. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much, Manuel, for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me on to present this evening, and thanks to you for coming in person and to those of you who are joining us online. I had an operation last week on my leg. I'm going to stand, but I may end up perching on this table. That's why, just to let you know. I'll do my best. So I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing over the last few years on the concept of hope in the context of probation. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the background to that research and so on. But before I go, just want to give a shout out to my co-researchers. This is absolutely a group project. So we're a diverse group of researchers, people with different levels of experience, academic experience, people with experience of being in prison and on probation, practitioner experience, and also policy kind of lobbying kind of experience too. So we've all brought our kind of expertise and perspectives and so on to bear on this study. I thought one of the members of the team would be, but she's not. It's just me. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a context, define what I mean by hope, or provide some definitions of hope that we kind of engage with through our research and through our thinking. Briefly go over the methods, but we'll hopefully spend the bulk of the time talking about our findings. So just a little bit of context. This project started really from a couple of conversations that I had with people 2 or 3 years ago, I suppose. That's research takes a long time to come to fruition. And the conversations generally revolved around the idea that hope seemed like a really powerful concept. We were aware that there was lots of literature out there on the concept of hope in the field of psychology, philosophy, sociology, and so on. And that there is research evidence, a reasonable body of evidence to suggest that when people do have hope, feelings of self-efficacy, optimism, and so on, then people are likely to also have higher levels of psychological and physical well-being. And given what we knew about people who find themselves under probation supervision, this seemed like an important idea to pursue. We were also aware that hope as a structure and concept had been explored in the context of prisons. So probably most immediately to mind come, Roz's and Rod and Shad's work on hope in prisons, but lots of others have kind of touched on, to varying degrees, the concept of hope in prison, and find that when people do have hope, then they are more likely to be able to kind of adapt to adverse situations of imprisonment, successfully move on from, harmful lifestyles, offending, criminalisation, and so on. And also within the field of desistance research, there was some evidence to suggest that when people had hope, that was somehow connected to then successful desistance away from offending. And Steve is one of the members of the research team, Steve Farrell, and in his longitudinal research on desistance, they absolutely found that those people who did have hope seemed to then go on to desist. But at the same time, we were aware, or it seemed to us, and it took us a little bit of research to confirm this, that really the concept of hope hadn't been particularly well explored in the context of probation. So the project emerged from those conversations that hope seems important. It seems to be important in other criminal justice contexts, but we didn't know very, very much about it in probation. Just by way of additional bit of context for those international people in the room who might have some, this talk is very much focused on probation in England and Wales. But that's not to say that I think the findings aren't relevant elsewhere. So probation in England and Wales is responsible for supervising people who are subject to community sanctions, so community order or suspended sentence order, and they are also responsible for supervising people for a period following release, depending on what kind of sentence what kind of custodial sentence they have been given. So probation in England and Wales supervises around 250,000 people at a given time, so around 3 times as many people as there are in prison in England and Wales. And its strapline, and it has been this the last few years, is assess, protect, change. So it's there to assess risk, manage risks, but also to facilitate change and so on. So off the back of that, we developed a research project which was funded by Research England via the University of Nottingham, where Steve Farrell is. And our broad research questions were, what do people on probation hope to get from probation? So what do they want to get out of it? What do they want to achieve in their lives when they are on probation and beyond? What do practitioners want to get from probation as a professional? And also, what do they see their clients hoping to get from probation? And then, in the eyes of those participants, does probation facilitate the fulfillment or achievement of those hopes? So fairly broad research questions. It was absolutely a kind of an exploratory study. We're not going to claim any causal inference between what probation does and hopes, but these are impressionists based on people's experiences of being under probation supervision and working in the system. So just a little bit about hope. It's a word that we use all the time. It's a word which is absolutely one of those words which has got lay understandings, fairly taken for granted understanding, but also quite kind of academic and technical specific definitions. Snyder's hope theory is probably the theory of hope which is most widely used and understood, certainly in the kind of field of psychology, criminology, and so on. Snyder's hope theory is a cognitive theory of hope, and essentially it's the idea that people have hope when they have a goal and are able to think how to get to that goal. So it's the perceived capability to derive pathways to desired goals and motivate oneself by agency thinking to use those pathways. So it's a way of thinking, essentially. And Snyder has done lots of research, and his team, around this. And absolutely, there's evidence to suggest that, you know, if we think hopefully, then it can be helpful in fostering adaptive rehabilitative processes. So that's really relevant to criminal justice work through the use of intervention techniques, creating goals, increasing pathways, thoughts, and then instilling greater agency. So for somebody to have hope in this kind of model, they need to know that they want to achieve something and know what that thing is. Probably it might be a little bit vague at various points in your life. They need to think that they have some degree of control over whether they are going to achieve that thing, but not total control over whether they are going to achieve that thing. So there needs to be something that is uncertain about it. So because if there's no uncertainty, then it's just a fact. Yeah, I will do this, not I hope I will do this. And if there's no certainty at all, then it's false hope. Then you've got no hope. I think for me, what's really interesting about Snyder's work is the connection between hope and agency. You need to have agency in order to think your way and achieve your hopes through that kind of cognitive approach. I'll come back to agency later on. The other kind of way of thinking about hope that we've drawn on quite a lot in this research is Seed's work on institutional transformational hope. So what Seeds did was he reviewed he did a lot of work for us, basically. He reviewed the literature on hope and came up with two different types of hope that we see often or potentially see in the kind of field of this and criminology. The first of these is institutional hopes. So these are the hopes that people have that are defined by and constrained by the institution that one finds oneself in. So it's a kind of a hope which is oriented within established ways of doing and thinking about things. And you achieve these hopes by using what is available to you within that institution. So for Seeds, in his article in the British Journal of Criminology, and others have used this too, and we've argued it, and I'll talk about it too for Probation. For people in prison, these institutional hopes might be a hope of getting released, hope of successfully getting through a parole oral hearing, hope of appealing a sentence or a conviction, hope of recapitalisation, something like that. Something which is absolutely contingent on the institution. I think, in my mind, they're often quite short-term hopes, not necessarily short-term in terms of, it could take many years, especially if you were, an intern in a sentence prisoner or something like that. But short-term in that the fulfillment of that hope ends when you exit that institution. Transformational hopes, on the other hand, Seeds argues, are hopes which are not invested in those existing legal kind of institutions and pathways. And this is hope which begins with the loss of the structures upon which daily life has been previously organised. So these are the narratives that we often hear when we talk to people who are in the criminal justice system or perhaps have got into, harmful drug use and so on, that they've hit rock bottom, perhaps, and decide that they want to move on, turn over a new leaf, lead a new life, or whatever it might be. So for these kind of institutional, transformational hopes to exist, those structures need to, that were giving life meaning, have kind of gone, and you need to find new structures. You need to reorientate and often redirect your way through a new way of living. And what I think is really interesting about transformational and deep hopes is that often those hopes are a bit obscured. bit vague sometimes, not always easy to define. Steve Fowler in his research on desistance found that people's deep hopes became more concrete as things progressed for them. So they got a better idea of what they wanted to achieve, what they were hoping for, but certainly initially often quite vague. And then in particular, what characterizes this type of hope is that the way to get to that deep hope is unknown. So Seeds talks about having to navigate, traverse unknown terrain or something like that. I can't remember the phrase that he uses. So you want to get from A to B. You might not know exactly what B is. You certainly don't know the route from A to B. So transformational hopes are much more longer term, much more about changing one's life, one's self-identity, narrative, and so on. It links to some of Shannon Moon's work on redemption scripts and confirmation scripts. So we use that kind of different distinction really between different hopes to make sense of some of our findings. So in terms of methods, our initial plan was, because we felt like hope was quite a powerful and potentially nebulous concept, we wanted to do something that was a bit creative with our methods. So our initial plan was to do our data collection through walks, through walking group kind of methodology. And what started off as a light-hearted comment turned into kind of almost into reality, in that we wanted to walk to the Village of Hope. So the Village of Hope is a village in the Peak District. It's a really beautiful village for any of you who haven't been there. And we thought these walks could act as, you know, the focal point for our conversations, both metaphorically and geographically. So we put in an application to HMPPS to do walking groups with people on probation to the Village of Hope, in which we would talk about hope with people who have experienced probation and collect our data. Unfortunately, and slightly ironically, given what I'm going to go on to say, that was deemed too risky a methodology to use. The probation region wasn't happy with us facilitating people on probation associating with another outside of formal groups and so on, like they don't already. So anyway, we couldn't do that, sadly. So what we did instead was we recruited a bunch of people who used to be on probation, and we did some walks with them about hope, and we co-designed the research interviews that we went on to do through that kind of process. So we did 3 walking groups with a mix of people, some of whom had been on probation a very long time ago, some more recently, some former practitioners as well. And we had 3 beautiful walks from the village of Leedale over there to the Village of Hope. And if we'd been able to do our research, they would have been fantastic. But sadly, we couldn't. Instead, we did semi-structured interviews with a whole group of people. You can see the people that we spoke to on the screen. And the interviews were carried out by different members of the research team. So, you know, then we've got people, well, academic, professional backgrounds, people with experience of legal profession, and so on. So we interviewed people who were on probation at the time, people who had been on probation, current and former probation practitioners, people who were working kind of on the edge of criminal justice, so kind of like in the third sector, but working with probation, working with people on probation, people in more kind of policy roles, and then some other stakeholders like people working in politics, sentencing. So we had a magistrate, a chaplain, you know, those genuinely interested people. So a really diverse group. And in terms of the analysis, we did the analysis as a group effort. So we got together as a group and analysed, went through transcripts kind of beforehand and then together, and very much took a kind of an inductive and thematic approach to that. So, to the findings. Our first question, if you remember, was what do people hope for when they are on probation? And overwhelmingly, the first thing that people talked about were things that could be quite easily characterised as institutional hopes. So we asked practitioners, we asked people on probation, what would you hope for? I just hope to get through to the end of this thing. I didn't really want to get anything out of it necessarily. I just wanted to get it over and done with so I could carry on with my life. For people who had experience of being unlicensed, so they had been in custody and then were unlicensed in the community, the purpose and their hope was to get to the end without being recalled. And that fear, I'll come back to that in a second, but that fear of recall loomed large over lots of people, especially those who we had a few people who were on IPP licenses and other people who'd been on very low licenses. And there was a sense amongst some of the interviews that you were really walking on eggshells, and there was this probation could just click their fingers and send you back to prison, flick of a switch. I think there's something complicated going on there, which I'm not going to go into right now. But this phrase here, make sure I tick the boxes necessary for me to get off license as quickly as possible, sums up lots of what people said. So that was an interesting finding in and of itself. But that's not to say that people didn't have deeper, more kind of transformational hopes in Seed's terms. And actually, with a bit of probing with interviews, it wasn't too difficult to get out a slightly deeper conceptualization or vision, really, of what people hope to get from probation. And it was really just kind of living quite normally. So this first quote, I think, captures quite nicely what these deep hopes were. In the end, it's just more of a hope of just living quite normally, just have a job. Never had anybody say they want to own a Caribbean island or a boat or anything like that. They just want to lead a normal life that's not causing harm, that's not being criminalised, victimised, being ashamed, and that kind of stuff. It's not extraordinary for most people. So that's kind of a slightly vague, obscure, but still, I think, fairly long-term, deep hope. Slightly more concrete one, we had quite a lot of examples, but being a better parent was one, and people talked about how probation could or should be able to help with achieving that kind of a hope that somebody might have. Other ones were about, absolutely related to kind of getting employment, but meaningful employment, not just a job, not just, whatever comes up, but a job that actually gives meaning to someone's life, gives them a sense of satisfaction, self-efficacy, and all that kind of thing. The other really, really key thing, really, it just stood out, all of it, when we got together to do our kind of first kind of proper talking about our data day, analysis day, was that across the interviews, there was a really, really strong message that probation, kind of as currently structured, serves to drown out these deep hopes. That yes, people do have deep hopes, but that actually the way probation is delivered doesn't really do very much to facilitate the fulfillment of those hopes. So we were very interested in why that was. And really 4 things kind of come out, maybe even 5 actually, but let's go through these 4. So the first is that tick box culture. So it came up time and time again amongst practitioners and amongst people who were on probation. That probation just feels like you are just being processed, and it's dehumanizing to be that person going through that process. That you just, it's too focused on the tick box checks. Have they been where they're supposed to be? Right, job done, next person. Not enough focus on, was there any quality work done there? Has there any change? Has any change happened? Have they turned up? Yes or no? Next, right one. And that's in the context of high workloads. We did the research, the data collection 2 years ago. Yeah, two to 2.5 years ago, probation absolutely was suffering from very high workload. It still is. But those workloads were really important kind of context to that. But it was something deeper than that. It was also a culture, I think, that was come through. There was also this narrative that probation was just too focused on compliance and technical compliance. So if you look at the literature on compliance, there's differentiation between technical compliance, which is just people turning up on time. Yes, have they done that? They're fine. They're complying with the order, and substantive engagement, substantive compliance, where people come along and properly engage with supervision and feel like they are getting something out of it, see the sentence as legitimate, see the institution as legitimate. There was a really strong narrative that there's just too much on the technical and not enough on the substantive. Again, I think that can partially be explained by workload pressures and so on. Another really strong theme that came out here was one of fear. So I mentioned already that fear of recall. Fear of recall, fear of breach was really strong. People really felt like, I just can't move on because I am fearful of being sent back to prison or being sent back to court. And practitioners acknowledged it too as an issue, but it was a stronger thing that came from people on probation. And what people felt like then was that they couldn't do anything which could be remotely be seen as slightly risky. It kind of hampered what people tried to achieve from life whilst they were on probation. And people talked about how they would just wait, they would just plan to wait, get through probation, and then I'll go and pursue that thing. Because if that all goes wrong, then there's potentially ramifications for me in my sentence. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And we don't know. You know, we've got to take what people say at face value. But that perception is just as important, maybe not just as, but it's certainly important and needs to be taken seriously. And then fear for staff was about a fear of serious further offences. This was in the aftermath of a series of pretty high-profile serious further offences for probation in England and Wales. I don't know whether this will have dissipated slightly, but it was really at the front of people's minds. And again, that fear was limiting, seemed to be limiting practice. It seemed to be limiting people's willingness to take risks as a practitioner, push boundaries a little bit, that kind of thing. I did an event last week for H&PPS in the Interfaith Week, and I talked about all this stuff. And there was a chaplain there who talked about a guy that he'd worked with at H&P Old Course, and how, as this guy was approaching release, the prison offender manager had kind of explicitly said, I'm gonna, you know, put some faith in you, and I'm gonna like really hope that you achieve what you want to do, and I'm gonna do everything to help you achieve those hopes. And that was described by the chaplain as risky behaviour. And I was like, that's like, whether or not it should be deemed as risky or not, but like for the probation service to see that as risky seems like something gone wrong. And I think that part of what's going on here is that there's too much, I don't know if that's quite the right phrase, but there's such a heavy emphasis on risk. And what I think that is being experienced by people is, it's just, if you focus too much on people's risks, then it's against their hopes. I think that quote at the bottom there is really powerful. I think we dash homes all the time in the way we have to risk manage, because that's inherently against somebody's hope. It's holding them back. Yes, of course, the probation service has to assess and manage risk. It's absolutely part of what it does. And public protection is, you know, some would argue, its primary kind of remit and responsibility. But that relationship between risk and desistance, or risk and rehabilitation, are sometimes described as two sides of the same coin. And I don't think that's quite right. I think that what our participants here are getting at is that it's more of it is a bit more of a zero-sum game than that. And actually, if you do too much focusing on the risk, then you do essentially drown out those deeper hopes that people have. So probation supervision was absolutely seen by some of our participants as hindering rehabilitation, because people are getting their shit together and then at the same time having constantly to go to probation and experiencing that inflexibility, and it's interfering with them moving on and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a bit of a negative story so far. Sorry for that, for those of you who are very heavily invested in probation. So I thought that this warranted a bit of deeper exploration, really. And actually, what we did then was we went back to the data and had a look at, okay, so people are telling us that people on probation do have deep hope, but that the way that probation is being delivered and is structured at the moment seems to be getting in the way of that. But we still heard examples from both staff and people with experience of probation, probably more the people who had been on probation in the past, I think, had that time to reflect back, maybe a little bit like what Steve Farrell found in his work, when he went back to people once they'd been on probation for a number of years, could look back and see actually potentially there was a little seed there that was sown and it took a few years for it to grow into a tree. So we looked at some of those stories around how probation has or was seen to have actually facilitated people's deep hopes. And I think there's something very interesting that we can tell from this. So lots of this will probably not come as a huge surprise to those of you who are engaged in some of the research around here, but it's captured quite nicely by this quote. She sat me and she asked me what I wanted to do and how I could use those probation hours to do something. She treated me like a human being. She asked me what I wanted, what I was interested in. That was a really powerful story. That was a guy who had been on probation loads of times. Classic, like, into his teens, heavy drug user, in and out of prison, got to his late 20s and had thought, I've had enough. And probation happened to be there about the right time for him. Good probation officer sat down and gave him the time and treated him as a human. And it was like the first time really that he felt like he'd been treated like a human by probation, and possibly by anybody actually. And within those kind of narratives of like the way that people described practice, which actually did serve to facilitate those deep hopes or was part of the journey, I guess. There were some really interesting things. So people, when they were talking about this kind of thing, how they had managed to achieve those deeper hopes and more meaningful hopes, they also were really explicit around talking about the contradictions and the paradoxes that are inherent to probation practice. So Liam, the former probationer, was like, I told her these meetings are doing more harm than good. He challenged the fact that probation, in his eyes, was not really helping him on one level, and that he was trying to make the most of. He was self-employed, but he was having to, duck out of work and that kind of stuff. And for him, that was part of how he challenged the problems that were coming from probation. And similarly, practitioners who were talking about this were like explicitly acknowledging the social aspect of rehabilitation, acknowledging the fact that people on probation will have experience and continue to experience systemic, structural disadvantage. The system is geared up against them. It's heavily weighted against staff doing their job and also against people who are trying to move on. So this contradiction between the system's kind of stated purpose of rehabilitation and then the way it was being experienced by people on probation, its enacted role of surveillance and punishment, was part of a process of becoming and realisation about what probation is. And so both of these quotes come from people who eventually kind of moved on and moved out of being under probation supervision. Well, Jack was still on probation, but he was, towards the end of his sentence. But he had gone through a bit of a journey from thinking it's not for me to actually I can work with these kind of contradictions, I guess. So those structural disadvantages and acknowledging them was seen as really important. What we should be doing is bolstering strengths and so on, absolutely. But we also have to be realistic. And I think that's a really kind of important kind of theme that comes out of this. That probation needs to be realistic about what it can do with people, and also realistic about people's situations and their lives. We say, in the words of this practitioner, we say too much to people, come in, we'll help you stop reoffending, your life will be rosy. But actually life is pretty freaking tough, especially for people who are on probation. Alongside that, people talked about the importance of addressing practical needs. It's been a long-standing kind of value that's underpinned probation work. But when you're working in a system which was just prioritizing kind of technical compliance and tick boxes and that kind of stuff and high workload pressures, it becomes really difficult to do the work which specifically addresses the fact that lots of offending and criminalisation has its roots in social exclusion, structural inequality, and so on. People talked about how, fair to say our practice was quite negative about probation, the current state of probation. Not as an idea, not as an institution necessarily, but the current state of it. And so people looked for little sources of hope and positivity. People talk quite a lot about as practitioners, getting hope from those little small steps that people that they work with were going to make, or did make. It might not be a lot to us, but it was a lot to them. Or getting kind of explicitly and trying hard to recognise that people might not have a lot going for them in their lives. They might be in a really hopeless situation, but actually there are ways of working which you can, make a lot out of a little. There was lots of stuff in there around strengths-based kind of work, being supportive, being advocates. I think that's another really important kind of thing about this. So recognising that, yes, people need to develop their, cognitive processes and thinking skills and, human capital and all that kind of stuff, get qualifications, but also people need to have somebody standing up for them in society, in a society which is generally quite negative towards people who have offended. And this was seen as a kind of a counter, a way of practicing, a hopeful way of practicing, which was a counter to this perception that the emphasis on risk was perpetuating this kind of deficit-focused way of working. Again, people emphasised the value and the importance of working with people, so not doing stuff to them, but if probation is going to work hopefully, help people facilitate, achieve these kind of deep purpose, then we need to be working alongside them, developing those relationships with us, and so on. Leaders were a little bit more concerned about delivery models and that kind of stuff, but it's a similar thing. It's like probation shouldn't just be working by itself. It shouldn't just be a silo within the wider kind of field of public services and the criminal justice system. Probation needs to work with people, both people on probation, but also other agencies and that kind of stuff. And so just to go back to that idea that, of all the narratives and the more positive stuff that we heard about how probation can and does and what people, the processes that people go through if and when probation is perceived to have actually helped them achieve those deep hopes, it's about being kind of human-centred, seeing people as people rather than just carriers of risk. And that allows people to imagine a different future rather than just a negative past. So what's going on here? Well, in order to make sense of this, drawing on Zachary's work on social notions of hope. So she works in the field of social work primarily. She argues that psychological conceptualization of hope, i.e. Snyder's work, focus on optimism, internal controls, external controls, motivation, that kind of stuff. And she argues that social work, and I think probation work does this too, draws on these relatively narrow definitions of hope. And what that does is it shifts the responsibility onto the person under supervision. Or for Zachary, shifts the responsibility onto the person who is on the social work caseload. So it says to them, look, you are on probation now. Yeah, we'll help you, but by and large, you need to navigate this yourself. And remember, when we're thinking about deep and transformational hopes, it's sometimes difficult to know how to navigate. You don't know that journey from A to B. You don't even necessarily know what B even is. So these individualizing notions of hope, as Zachary puts it, are, they ignore those broader social injustices and inequalities that reinforce those unequal power relations. So I think my concern is that probation works in this way, pushes responsibility down to people and ignores those wider social inequalities. Social notions of hope, meanwhile, again, this is a quote from Zachary, tend to focus on external sources and the surroundings, the contexts in which people are living their lives, the culture, the politics, and that kind of stuff. The experiences, the relationships, the social effects of hope, such as mobilization, solidarity, and so on. So I think that when we think about those narratives around when probation is able to facilitate those deep hopes, it connects in my mind with this more kind of social way of thinking about hope. That hope is not something that people can just achieve by themselves. They have to achieve it in recognition of the wider social context and with people within that wider social context. So we can then kind of make some connections to kind of critical definitions of hope, drawing on kind of some big ideas, I guess. So critical hope, drawing on kind of Paulo Freire's work on the pedagogy of the oppressed. He argues that critical hope for people to have, for him, it's about education. And education is about giving people this critical hope, which is about recognizing challenges, systemic issues, whilst still believing in the possibility of positive change. So it's not to say that probation practitioners should absolve people of responsibility totally, but that probation has a role in both recognizing those inequalities, injustices, but at the same time, believing that they can change and helping them to change. So it's about being realistic of the situation. Radical hope, drawing on Jonathan Lear's work and how communities in the face of kind of catastrophe can still have hope for a better future, even when they are kind of totally unknowable. I think we see examples of this in some of those narratives that we heard, that even when somebody's life looks pretty hopeless, or they describe their lives as hopeless, there's a really important role for probation to be like, no, you actually, there is something, let's work out where you might want to get to. It requires imagination, and that's not always easy when you're working in a really busy, process-driven kind of a role. But kind of radical hope theorists would theorize this as a fairly kind of defiant act. And then for me, collective hope, I think, is really important, doing things with people. So when we kind of create conditions for collective hope, it involves having shared desires. So it's about co-production. It's about working with people on probation. What do you want to get to? How are we going to get there together? But it involves community as well and that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily easy and concrete and so on, but perhaps more as a principle or an ideology that underpins what we're trying to do. So I think I said I'd come back to agency. So I'm back to agency. I think that the hopeful practice that we heard about was practice which really was about giving people, what's the best way of phrasing it? I suppose, providing the conditions in which people might feel more able to exercise their agency. So Rebecca Solnit, feminist thinker, philosopher, says that hope's not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It's an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. And I think that's really powerful. I think that we need to think about hope as something which people have and use in order to kind of get to where they want to, but it at the same time acknowledges that there's going to be things in their way. And that hope is a kind of gives agency, but also acknowledges it's not necessarily going to be easy to where you need to get to in that emergency. So in this kind of conceptualization, hope is a call for action, I guess. And I think these kind of social forms of hopeful practice, these forms of hopeful practice which take the social context much more into account, in theory anyway, provide more opportunity for people to exercise their agency. And I think a key part of them is that they're much more realistic, and they treat people as people, they treat them holistically. So I think that there is something to be said for thinking about probation as an institution of hope. I think at the moment, probation is a regulatory institution, in Valerie Braithwaite's words. But institutions of hope, Braithwaite, are ones which offset, loosen, and challenge constraints which are imposed by regulatory institutions. Institutions of hope moves collectively away from a social script that makes engaging and shaping our future seem futile, towards one which we're expected to be active and responsible citizens. And I think if probation can move somewhere in that direction, then hopefully we would start to see less of those forms of practice which emphasise and prioritise institutional hopes, and more practice which allows people to achieve those deep hopes. Thank you very much for listening.